What's up, Canada? Welcome back to Canadian Insights, and wow, do I have a plot twist for you today. Doug Ford, yes, that Doug Ford, the Premier who's usually about as predictable as a Tim Hortons order, just agreed with Mark Carney. I know, I had to check the calendar to make sure we didn't slip into some alternate dimension. But here we are, folks. Ford and New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt are backing Carney's statement that there's basically nothing normal about the United States anymore. And honestly, when Doug Ford is out here sounding diplomatic and measured, you know things have gotten absolutely wild. So grab your maple syrup security blanket because we're diving into what happens when Canadian premiers unite against the chaos machine south of the border. Let me set the scene for you because this is important context. Ford and Holt were doing a joint announcement about increasing trade between Ontario and New Brunswick, which sounds boring until you realize why they're suddenly so interested in interprovincial trade. Hint, it rhymes with trade war and starts with Donald Trump losing his mind over tariffs. So they're standing there, celebrating Canadian provinces actually working together, which is already newsworthy because getting Canadian provinces to cooperate on anything is like herding cats wearing ice skates. And then someone asks them about Carney's comments that nothing's normal in the US anymore. Doug Ford, bless him, doesn't hesitate. He straight up says I agree with him. I think the whole world is watching that, including Americans. Now, for those of you who don't follow Ontario politics religiously, Doug Ford agreeing with Mark Carney on anything is like finding out your cat suddenly speaks French. These are not two people who typically see eye to eye on policy. Ford's a populist conservative who built his brand on being the anti-elite everyman. Carney's a former central banker who literally governed the Bank of England. They're not exactly natural allies. But apparently, American chaos is such a unifying force that it's bringing together Canadian politicians from across the spectrum like some kind of diplomatic Avengers initiative. And Ford doesn't stop there. Oh no, he keeps going. He says it's unfortunate that Trump has taken this avenue, which is the most polite way anyone has ever described what's essentially economic hostage-taking. But then Ford drops this absolute gem: a tariff on Canada is a tax on Americans. Chef's kiss. Because he's absolutely right. Every tariff Trump slaps on Canadian goods makes things more expensive for American consumers and businesses. Canadian aluminum in American trucks? More expensive. Canadian lumber in American houses? More expensive. Canadian energy keeping American lights on? You guessed it, more expensive. But sure, let's pretend this is somehow punishing Canada without any consequences for the US economy. Now let's talk about Susan Holt because her comments are equally important and frankly, a bit more unsettling. Holt agrees with Carney that nothing is the same anymore in the Canada-US relationship. But then she gets specific, and this is where it gets real. She mentions ICE agents on the border between New Brunswick and Maine. Immigration enforcement agents. On the Canadian border. Let that sink in for a second. This isn't some abstract policy discussion happening in Ottawa boardrooms. This is boots on the ground, visible changes to how the border operates, and it's making Canadians uncomfortable. Holt says there's nothing they recognize in their neighbors right now with the current leadership. That's a pretty devastating statement when you think about it. We're talking about a relationship that's supposedly the longest undefended border in the world, decades of partnership, integrated economies, shared cultural ties, and now a Canadian premier is basically saying we don't recognize who you've become. It's like watching your best friend from high school turn into someone completely different, except your best friend controls the world's largest economy and has the nuclear codes. But here's what I find absolutely fascinating about this whole situation. You've got premiers from different parties, different provinces, different political philosophies, all singing the same tune. Ford's a progressive conservative. Holt's a liberal. Carney leads a liberal federal government. Under normal circumstances, these people would be fighting about carbon taxes, healthcare funding, and equalization payments. But Trump's trade war has created such a threat that suddenly everyone's on the same page. It's like that scene in every disaster movie where people who hate each other have to work together because the alternative is extinction. Except instead of asteroids or aliens, it's tariffs and ICE agents. The fact that they are making this announcement while promoting interprovincial trade is also incredibly strategic. They're essentially saying if the Americans want to make trade difficult, fine, we'll trade more with each other. It's the economic equivalent of you can't fire me, I quit. Ontario and New Brunswick strengthening trade ties isn't going to replace the massive trade relationship with the US, obviously. But it sends a message. Canada has options. We're not completely helpless. We can adapt. And maybe, Just maybe, American politicians should consider whether pushing their most reliable trading partner into economic self-sufficiency mode is actually a smart long-term strategy. Let's zoom out for a second and look at what Carney actually said that started all this. His original comment was that there's almost nothing normal now in the United States. And you know what? Look around. He's not wrong. We've got an administration that treats allies like adversaries, threatens to tear up trade agreements on a whim, slaps tariffs on countries for nebulous national security reasons, and apparently thinks diplomatic relations should be conducted via social media rants and cable news interviews. That's not normal. That's not how stable, predictable, rule-based international relations are supposed to work. The normalization of abnormality is maybe the scariest part of all this. We've gotten so used to the chaos that when someone points out, hey, this is actually insane, it's treated like a controversial statement. Carney saying nothing's normal shouldn't be a hot take. It should be an obvious observation. But here we are, with premiers having to back him up because apparently stating the obvious now requires political courage. And let's talk about what this means for regular Canadians, because policy discussions are great, but this affects real people. If you work in an industry that exports to the US, you're nervous. If your company relies on cross-border supply chains, you're scrambling to figure out contingency plans. If you live in a border community where the economy depends on cross-border cooperation, you're watching ICE agents show up and wondering what happened to the friendly relationship you grew up with. This isn't abstract. This is people's livelihoods, communities, and sense of security being thrown into uncertainty because someone decided that burning down decades of partnership was good politics. Ford's comment about the whole world watching is also critically important. This isn't just Canada noticing that America's acting weird. Everyone's noticing. Allies across Europe, Asia, everywhere are watching the US abandon predictability and reliability in favor of whatever policy sounds good at a rally or scores points with a political base. And they're making calculations about what that means for their own relationships with America. Can you trust a country that might tear up agreements whenever there's a change in administration? Can you build long-term economic strategies with a partner that treats trade like a reality TV show? These are questions every country is asking right now. Here's the thing that makes this situation so frustrating. The Canada-US relationship should be the easiest one for America to maintain. We're not adversaries. We don't have territorial disputes. We don't have fundamental ideological conflicts. We're literally neighbors who share democratic values, integrated economies, and mutual defense agreements. If America can't maintain a stable relationship with Canada, what hope is there for more complicated international partnerships? It's like failing at friendship on easy mode. Holt's comment about being eager to support Americans in returning to the strong partnership of previous generations is also telling. She's basically saying we're ready to go back to normal whenever you are. It's an olive branch wrapped in a diplomatic critique. Canada's not looking to escalate. We're not trying to start some kind of international feud. We just want the reliable, predictable, mutually beneficial relationship back. Is that really too much to ask? But the cynical part of me wonders if this unity among Canadian premiers will actually matter to the Trump administration. They've shown pretty clearly that they don't particularly care what allies think. They've demonstrated that domestic political considerations trump, pun intended, international relationship management. So Ford and Holt and Carney can all agree that things are abnormal, but will that change anything? Or are we just documenting the breakdown of a relationship while the other party isn't even listening? The interprovincial trade angle is actually kind of brilliant though. For years, Canada struggled with internal trade barriers. It's sometimes easier to trade with the US than with other Canadian provinces because of different regulations, standards, and protectionist policies. If the current situation forces provinces to finally get their act together and create a more integrated Canadian market, that's actually a silver lining. Economic resilience through domestic cooperation. Who knew Trump's trade war would accidentally solve Canadian interprovincial trade issues? What's also interesting is the political risk Ford's taking here. His base includes a lot of people who are sympathetic to Trump's politics. By agreeing with Carney and criticizing Trump's approach, Ford's potentially alienating some of his own supporters. But apparently the threat is serious enough that he's willing to take that risk. When a populist conservative premier is more concerned about defending Canada's economic interests than maintaining ideological alignment with a foreign leader, that tells you how serious the situation is. The ICE agents on the border thing that Holt mentioned deserves more attention too. Immigration enforcement at the Canadian border has traditionally been pretty chill compared to, say, the Mexican border. We're talking about a border where people used to cross for lunch and cross back without drama. Now you've got immigration enforcement creating visible presence and tension. That's a fundamental shift in how the border operates, and it's making people uncomfortable for good reason. It changes the character of border communities and the ease of cross-border life that people have enjoyed for generations. So where does all this leave us? Well, we've got unusual political unity in Canada around the idea that America's behavior is abnormal. We've got provinces strengthening trade ties with each other as a hedge against US unpredictability. We've got premiers from different parties backing the Prime Minister's assessment of the situation. And we've got a border that's starting to feel less like the world's longest undefended border and more like, well, an actual defended border with immigration agents and tension. The question is whether any of this matters to the people making decisions in Washington. Will American policymakers care that their closest ally is collectively saying this isn't normal and we don't recognize you anymore? Or will it just be more noise in a news cycle that moves too fast for anything to stick? History suggests that damaging relationships is easy and rebuilding them is hard. The US might think it can treat Canada however it wants and will just come crawling back because we need the relationship. But relationships, even between countries, require mutual respect. And right now, that respect is evaporating faster than a puddle in July. Alright Canada, that's the situation. Doug Ford and Susan Holt backing Mark Carney's assessment that nothing's normal with the US anymore, interprovincial trade getting a boost from international chaos, and Canadian premiers united in their concern about where this relationship is heading. If you want to keep up with this developing story, because trust me it's going to keep developing, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're covering Canadian politics multiple times a day because apparently that's how fast things move now. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Is Canada's united front going to make any difference, or are we just yelling into the void? I'll see you in the next video where we'll probably be discussing whatever unprecedented thing happens next in this unprecedented timeline. Stay informed, stay united, and stay Canadian.